scarcity of marriageable white women, many colonists of all classes took indigenous wives or companions and fathered these children. Having been an indigenous place forever before the whites came, for at least the first 3 decades, Seattle was still a thoroughly indigenous place.
Now, the existence of this middle ground of cooperation and accommodation, and Seattle's reliance on it, did not prevent or resolve all tensions. After all, this was still 1850s white supremacist America. Some of the early colonists were open to a mixed society. However, the majority of the population was still very racist and wanted to go to segregated. Allow me a second to paint the scene. I'm back now on Yesler Way, which used to be known as Mill Street. Now, the terrain to the south was significantly transformed in the early 20th century. King Street is 4 blocks behind it, and everything south of there, west of I-5, down to about the West Seattle Bridge, used to be a tidal mudflat. Between King and Mill, what used to be a waterfront, the ground was flat, and north of Mill, it began to rise. Along the waterfront here is where the city's poor and working class lived. The city's elite inhabited the dry, neatly kept hills north of Mill. Thus, there was a very visible class divide in early Seattle between the dirty poors south of Mill, the literal downtown, and the prim and proper wealthy elite north and uptown of Mill. This class divide has driven much of the city's internal conflict throughout its early history, even up to the present day. Along the waterfront here is also where all the saloons, gambling houses, and brothels were set up. A district of sin and vice which came to derogatorily be known as the lava beds. Much of Seattle's indigenous population also lived in this waterfront neighborhoods, and the brothels were staffed almost exclusively by indigenous women. The city's middle ground, with all of its concomitant interaction with the Amish and other local natives, caused a moral panic amongst the white upper class. Indigenous people and their cultures were seen as inherently morally corrupt and corrupting. It was feared that any accommodation with indigeneity within the new city would degrade the purity of white culture and the white soul. And the lava beds served as the perfect example of this. The emergence of the hives of scum and villainy that were the saloons, brothels, and gambling houses was seen as the consequence of the moral rot that resulted from too much interaction with the dirty Indians. The poor white residents of the lava beds were framed by some as hapless victims of the temptations of the Indian flesh, who then blew all their money on booze, cars, and Indian women, and were thus reduced to their state of poverty by the moral corruption wrought from the race mixing. There was a very real fear that if Seattle didn't deal with its Indian problem, the moral rot would spread, and the whole city would thus be dragged down and destroyed.
最も遠い距離は時間の距離ではない。愛する心と心の遠い距離だ。僕たちはそんなに強くない。それでも生きている。
Seattle's indigenous population was also stereotyped as being disease-ridden and a fire threat. Both of these prejudices had an insidious cruelty to them. First, it was indigenous people who were dying of diseases introduced by the whites, not the other way around. And of the two major fires to strike the city throughout its history, the 1879 fire was started in a middle-class hotel, and the 1889 Great Fire was started in a cabinet maker's shop, both started by whites. Yet, indigenous and lower-class victims in general of both blazes were largely left to fend for themselves, while the city focused its efforts on rebuilding the damage done to the upper class and business districts. There were also numerous cases of arson that targeted indigenous neighborhoods, but we'll talk about those in a bit.
As the city leaders saw it, the solution to this Indian problem was segregation. Seattle was officially incorporated as a city in 1856, and one of its first city ordinances barred all indigenous persons from residing within the city limits. In a perfect demonstration of Seattle's problem with not liking indigenous people, but relying on indigenous labor, the law carved out a specific exception, allowing indigenous employees of white businesses to be housed by their employers. The 1850s and 60s also saw the enactment of territory-wide anti-miscegenation laws that outlawed all interracial marriages in Washington and barred the mixed children of white fathers from inheritance. However, we still have records of marriages being performed even while these laws were in effect. It seems not everyone was so morally incensed. The moral panic was a bit more of an upper-class problem. After all, somebody had to be keeping the brothels in business. But there was something that whites of all backgrounds and social positions wanted: land. And they all agreed that the first step to get that land was to get rid of its current inhabitants.
Thus, from late 1854 to early 1856, Governor Isaac Stevens went on a tour of the Washington Territory and brokered several treaties with Washington tribes. The goal, which was only partially accomplished, was to extinguish the indigenous title to all the land in Washington and confine its indigenous inhabitants to reservations. Seattle's land was covered by the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott, along with all the land between the Cascades and the Sound from north of Mount Rainier to the Canadian border. Many natives found the provisions of their treaties severely objectionable and made their concerns known in the negotiations. Stevens allowed some compromises, but not nearly enough, and this American recalcitrance led tribes and their leaders across Washington Territory to break out in open warfare. The war, though spread across large swaths of the territory and fought over similar grievances, was not centrally coordinated and was experienced more as a collection of local conflicts. Thus, it's known by several regional names: the Yakima and Palouse Wars in eastern Washington, and the Puget Sound War or Chief Leschi's War here in western Washington. One engagement of the Puget Sound War was the January 26, 1856 Battle of Seattle.
Seattleites had expected an attack since the outbreak of hostilities in October, and attacks on outlying homesteads south of town only solidified this belief. Thus, the Navy sloop USS Decatur had been stationed in Elliott Bay, and townsfolk had built a blockhouse and other defenses with the help of Marines from the Decatur. The blockhouse was built about 3 blocks that way, underneath what is now a parking lot on the corner of First and Cherry. I'm currently standing in City Hall Park next to a monument to the battle installed in 1916 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Now, not all local natives wanted war. Seattle counseled his people against it, and another chief known to the colonists as Curly Jim warned his white neighbors that an attack was imminent in the early morning hours of January 26th. This heads-up gave Seattle's 50-some white residents time to escape to the blockhouse and man the defenses. Sympathetic indigenous warriors also fought alongside their white neighbors in defense of the city. If not for this help from indigenous people, the battle may well have ended very differently. As it stood, only 3 colonists died, and 2 of those from friendly fire, and the attackers retreated around 10 p.m. The war ended here in the West in March of 1856 after only a winter's worth of fighting. This theater's principal chief, Leschi in his native Lushootseed, was captured later that November. In what is seen widely now, and even amongst some then, as a sham trial, he was charged and convicted of murder of a white soldier and hanged in 1858. The war did bring the U.S. government to modify some treaty terms, and the Puyallup and Nisqually both got better reservations out of it. A new reservation, Muckleshoot, was also established for people from multiple tribes living in the upstream areas of the White and Green Rivers. The Nisqually and Puyallup's successes in modifying their reservation unfortunately would not be repeated by the Duwamish. The 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott did not grant the Duwamish a reservation in their home territory of Seattle. Instead, it required them to move either across the Sound to the Suquamish Reservation or north to the Tulalip Reservation. When the Muckleshoot Reservation was established to the south in 1857, it added another possible destination to the list. Even after many Duwamish defended Seattle against other indigenous people during the war, the government and their white neighbors would still not make a reservation in the Seattle area itself. Many Duwamish would eventually make the moves to the out-of-town reservations. Some moved away only to return owing to poor conditions and lack of food on their assigned reservations. Understandably, many Duwamish wanted to stay in their homes and never left. Considering how reliant Seattle was on indigenous labor, it's a good thing, too, that many Duwamish stayed. The Duwamish residents who kept the city alive worked to petition the U.S. government for a reservation within their homelands. The effort was even supported by local Indian agent Thomas Page. After years of cajoling, the federal government finally relented, and in 1866 promised the Duwamish a reservation right here on the north shore of the Black River in what is today the Bryn Mawr Skyway neighborhood on the southern end of Lake Washington. As you can probably guess, that reservation never materialized. When white Seattleites heard of this nefarious scheme to let the Duwamish stay in their homes, they were not pleased, and they petitioned their congressional delegate Arthur Denny, yes, that Arthur Denny, to kill the deal. The petition was signed by practically every white man then living in King County, including all the leading figures of Seattle's founding. David Denny, Doc Maynard, Henry Yesler, Arthur Denny himself, yes, he signed a petition addressed to himself, etc. Now, here's an important thing to note. At the time, there were at best a handful of white families living anywhere in the Black River neighborhood, and none within the proposed boundaries of the reservation. This area would not be significantly colonized for another 10 years. However, it had been known since 1853 that there were coal deposits along the Black River. Now, mining would not start significantly for another decade either. The white Seattleites knew the coal was here. The colonizers' issue with the reservation was not that it would displace any currently settled white folk. It was that it would prevent them from taking and mining this land at some undetermined point in time in the future. For the growth-obsessed, manifest destiny-minded, and let's be honest, greedy colonizers, telling them even a sliver of land was off-limits was simply unacceptable. Thus, for the sake of future growth and progress, and giving white folk what they wanted, the deal was shelved, and the Duwamish denied their reservation. Still to this day, in 2023, 160 years later, the Duwamish do not have a reservation. 1883 saw the beginning of a dramatic shift in Seattle. That year, the railroad connected the city overland to the rest of the United States, bringing in massive numbers of new colonists. Seattle entered a period of exponential growth in its non-Indigenous population over the next 4 decades, from around 4,000 in 1880 to 80,000 in 1900, and from there to 300,000 in 1920. The arrival of all these new colonizers sparked a change in Seattle's disposition towards its indigenous population. Gone were the days of the mixed-race middle ground. Now, there were finally enough white colonizers and heritable white women that it was no longer needed.